Thank you so much to everyone that became a paying Patreon member last week, and to the people that upgraded their memberships to give us some more money every month. Thank you so much. Every single penny and pound helps us to keep the show running. A few hundred people make this show possible, and it really is a team effort. Watching how stories move through the news, it's really easy to see how wealthy and often right-wing interests shape the mainstream media agenda. They can hijack the headlines, they can set the framing. Before the facts can come in, the loudest, most certain, most confident voices get the headline. The people actually affected get a line near the bottom, if at all. And by the time anyone corrects the record, it is too late. Over the Top, Under the Radar exists to change all of that. We'll try and slow things down, take a deeper look at the big stories, the ones being overlooked, and give you the context to make up your own mind. We are Patreon supported proudly, which means we answer to you and nobody else. No advertisers, no big tech platform deciding what we're allowed to say, and no billionaires. Here's the part I really want you to hear. Your support is the reason this show exists at all. Every supporter is a small concrete vote for media that nobody owns. If it matters to you, please be part of keeping it going. Go to patreon.com/overthetop under the radar. Thank you. I'm Carys Afoko.
And I'm Fatima Ibrahim.
We are on a mission to make sense of the news, to understand why the media obsesses over some stories, completely ignores others, and what will the King of the North be called when he moves down south?
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar.
I have a returning co-host. Always love it when someone comes back. Returning co-host for this week is Fatima Ibrahim, who is the co-director of the amazing Green New Deal Rising, which you should look up if you don't know them, and all-round badass human. Thank you for coming
Thanks for having me back.
Welcome back. How have you been?
I've been good. It's been a busy summer. I was kind of hoping we're recording the day after England has crashed out of the World Cup. Yeah. And I had this dreams of us like kind of wearing our jerseys and being excited about it, and instead I'm quite down about that. But anyway.
So it probably is worth saying we're recording this due to a holiday. I mean, Fatima and I are both going to be on vacation, on holiday when you listen to this. So we're recording this the day after England got knocked out of the World Cup, a few days before Andy Burnham becomes our next Prime Minister, failing some very dramatic things. And so this is going to be an Andy Burnham special, a new Prime Minister special, pre-recorded for you. I really wanted to talk to you about it, Fatima, because you do so much of your work is focused on like political reality and politicians. And we had a whole conversation about Andy Burnham. And so I was like, I feel like I want to bring you back and talk about it. How are you feeling before we get into the overs and unders? Like, how are you feeling about another new Prime Minister?
You know what? I feel cautiously optimistic. And in some ways, I've been distant to the news because it's really not about the kind of internal politicking. We just have a new opportunity. And as long as there's like doors open, I always have belief in people power. And as a campaigner, I'm like, yay, there's new doors for us to push open and we should be optimistic and make the most of them.
I love that. That's kind of like, it's like positive, but also pragmatic. And I think you're right. I think for like, I have, lots of views on Keir Starmer, but it didn't feel like there was an open door to campaigners. Like there were a lot of U-turns and a lot of flip-flops, but yeah, it wasn't really clear that you could pressure him. And obviously he was very hostile on some issues that I care a lot about that he just seemed like he wouldn't turn around on. So Andy Burnham, new Prime Minister. I mean, how long you've been in the UK for a long time? How many PMs deep are you? 6?
Since I was 9, so I think the Prime Minister is Tony Blair. When I
was, I mean, it's been in the last couple of years. Let's hope Andy Burnham's good, and let's hope he lasts a little bit longer than some of the others. But so Fatima and I have taken a look at Andy Burnham and all of the media coverage around him, and we've each picked one topic we think the media has gone over the top on, and one we think has flown completely under the radar and not been talked about enough. Is that possible? Because all we seem to be doing is talking about Andy Burnham. But you're going to kick us off, Fatima. What is your over the top?
So no surprise as a climate campaigner that my over the top is North Sea oil, which it feels like has been nonstop in the news for the last few months. And the reason I picked it is like, why is it in the news? Why do we always find a kind of a new way of them reporting, whether it's about the Iran war and whether we should be drilling for new oil, or it's specifically about new oil and gas fields like Jackdaw and Rosebank, or whether it's about Ed Miliband and whether Ed Miliband can be trusted to run an economy where oil and gas is a part of it. And what we need to understand is like, this is a deliberate ploy by the industry in cahoots actually with some unions to influence who the cabinet picks are. Right. And they're setting the political terrain. Politics isn't just about winning the argument. It's about defining the argument. So why, as we're getting a new prime minister, is North Sea oil and gas proposed as the defining test of this new prime minister?
It's a great over the top. And like, I really wanted to get into it with you because I am not a climate campaigner and I'm not an expert, especially on fossil fuels. So my understanding is lots of countries have oil. Some countries have more oil than others, e.g. Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Venezuela.
Yeah.
The UK has some oil in the North Sea. And like, that's the main oil we have access to, control over. And we have an oil industry, which is kind of concentrated in Scotland because that's near the North Sea. Am I right so far?
You are right so far, except the distinction is in the countries that you used as examples, for them, actually, their oil reserves are nationalized. And so there's like national sovereign entities that like citizens directly benefit from that oil and gas. Whereas in the UK, that's not the case. We have a lot of the time foreign companies who are extracting this oil and selling it on the international markets. The way that we benefit is through tax, yes, but we don't own that oil and gas in the same way as, for example, Saudi Arabia does, or Venezuela does, or a lot of the Middle Eastern countries do.
That makes a lot of sense. And thank you for calling that out. It's also, in some very oil-rich nations like Oman, people don't even pay energy bills.
Yeah.
And you're right. Okay, so we have this oil, but we don't have it. We get private companies to drill it and process it so that it can be and sell it. And we get a cut of that through tax revenues. And so we have this North Sea oil. We also know that we cannot continue to keep drilling fossil fuels. Like the climate is changing. The world is heating up. It's not sustainable for us to rely on fossil fuels like oil for our energy sources. And yet you're right. I feel like in the last few months, and Andy Burnham is part of it, but he's not all of it, there's been a sense that the solution to various problems, whether it's conflict with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz closing, whether it's, I don't know, like a by-election in Aberdeen, which has like got a big oil industry presence, there's this sense of like, we need to drill North Sea oil because oil prices have gone up. Or like, we need to drill North Sea oil because Ed Miliband's a crazy lefty and he has to satisfy us. But so like, what is going on here?
To me, and this is an incredible campaigning effort. Like from afar, there's almost like a bit of admiration in the sense that like, this is how campaigning works, where you bring what seem like disparate interests together. And so they've brought unions together who have a real case advocating for workers who need a just transition.
So workers working in the oil industry.
Workers working in the oil industry who we've not given a good enough solution to what happens when their jobs go away, and the communities who get left behind. The industry who just wants to drill, baby drill. And lots of the media, like who, have a case against net zero and want to start driving this wedge in parts of the country where they're saying actually the biggest threat to you is net zero or immigrants, and like distract people from the real drivers of the cost of living. And so there's no consistent argument, because when you try and bat it away and say, actually, these new oil and gas fields won't bring down energy bills, they say, well, what about the workers? Or what about this? And so this is why I say it's an orchestrated campaign. And actually the aim of that campaign is to shape this government and to shape who is kind of in the driving seat of this government. And it looks like they might succeed.
Yeah, it's so interesting to watch it. And you're right, there's a degree of like game recognized game. When the conflict in Iran began and the US started attacking Iran and the Strait of Hormuz got closed and oil prices soared, I thought, And the UK disproportionately was impacted by that. Of all G7 economies, the UK was the most vulnerable to that shock in the oil price, which, is something that is normally more true of developing economies, that they're very sensitive to like market fluctuations. So when our economic headroom apparently disappeared, when the economy tanked because of what was happening in Iran, I thought, gosh, there's a real case for stopping being dependent on fossil fuels, right? But actually, and like you're right, I listened to The Spectator, which is a right-wing magazine owned by a man who has a lot of fossil fuel interests, Rupert Murdoch, who owns lots of other right-wing media, famously not really too keen on climate change. So like the owners of these outlets have a particular politics. Yeah, on The Spectator, they were like, well, obviously we need to draw more on the North Sea. So like the straw man case is like, we need to draw more to keep the oil price down. Like the Aberdeen by-election was won by the Tories because they made a big thing about protecting oil jobs. So there's
again, it's an inconsistent argument because one, it won't bring down the prices. I mean, I'm not an energy expert, but I spent a lot of time trying to understand this. And actually, the way our energy regime is set up is that even if for example, we have way more energy now that is produced by renewables, but the price is still set by the most expensive input into the energy system. So we're tethered to gas, which, as the markets go up because of the war in Iran, gas becomes very expensive, oil becomes very expensive, and then therefore it drives the prices of our bills, even if the amount of our energy system that is powered by these inputs is minimal, we're still tethered to that price. So Ed Miliband has proposed a way of like untethering our energy system from oil and gas, which is a systemic level change, which is great. The other argument is around jobs. Well, people are losing their jobs anyway, right? Like as in, regardless of the net zero transition, more and more jobs are being lost in communities that are around the North Sea. And so we need to think long term. And, the truth that maybe nobody wants to say is that it won't be easy and there won't be like for like jobs. And so we need an industrial strategy. Like I would take this argument at face value if the thing that was on the papers was we need an industrial strategy. We need a plan for places like Aberdeen, not just jobs, investments. How do we reshape these economies? And that isn't what they're saying. They're just saying, let's drill more. And that will not answer the question of jobs that are being lost anyway, and it won't bring down energy bills.
My over the top for the week is the debate about who will be Andy Burnham's chancellor. So, I mean, it's been, I'd say, ever since the middle of May, when it started to look like Keir Starmer wouldn't survive the local elections and that Andy Burnham was going to try and get a seat. We've had a lot of speculation about like who he likes, who he's going to hire, who he supports, what he believes. But I think the most kind of fever pitch speculation is around who will be his Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I think that is not without good reason. After the Prime Minister, the most powerful politician in the country is normally the Chancellor. They hold the purse strings. They run the Treasury, like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, David Cameron and George Osborne, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, maybe not quite so much in the Hall of Fame. Like it's a really important job. Often the Chancellor of the Exchequer is like a political partner or like number two to the Prime Minister. So like really important job. Again, if you're listening, Andy, definitely important you pick someone who can do it well. It's really going to shape your agenda. But I think that there's a couple of things that this fevered coverage, which is like, the British lobby at its worst, which is just basically reporting gossip and rumours. So we had like a big Times headline, big FT headlines this week about Andy Burnham's made his decision and it's not Ed Miliband. And, we're talking about headlines that like potentially move the gilt markets, that have this real impact, and this fevered speculation that journalists like to make and that drives headlines about, well, broadly speaking, there was an assumption that Andy Burnham would pick Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband is a political ally of his. If the reports are to be believed, Ed Miliband was one of the first members of the cabinet to go into Keir Starmer and say, hey, bro, I think maybe your time's up. And Ed Miliband is also on what we now call the soft left. So like the, not that right-wing bit of the Labour Party, but not as left-wing as Jeremy Corbyn, which Andy Burnham is from.
That's the spectrum.
That's a spectrum. I can't stress to the extent to which the spectrum is so narrow in the Labour Party now. So like we really are splitting hairs. So there's Ed Miliband in one corner, the sort of presumptive candidate who's had a lot of attacks from right-wing media, a lot of briefing from other parts of the soft left. So I read a whole thing with, about Louise Haig and Annalise Midgley, two other like soft left MPs saying they don't want him because the unions don't want him. And he's a namby-pamby liberal southerner. So so Ed Miliband, very controversial potential candidate. There is Shabana Mahmood, who is not.
How that has happened is beyond me.
Those not watching the video will not have seen Fatima's amazing facial reaction. So Shabana Mahmood, current Home Secretary, not from the part of the party that Andy Burnham's from. She has been at the helm of some very politically contentious, I would say awful, and very unpopular in the Labour Party policies. So there's a rumour she's going to be the Chancellor. And this is, he's going to be tough and he's going to pick Shabana. There's a few other people's hats that get thrown in the ring. Rachel Reeves, bless her, tried to throw her hat in. I don't think that's happening. We can talk about chancellors and their personalities and who likes them and who doesn't and what signal it sends till the cows come home. But if the new chancellor keeps Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules and sticks to the letter of the law on the Labour's 2024 manifesto, it won't really matter that much who they are. And so I'm going to just dig into that, and I'd love to kind of hear your reflections as well. So broadly speaking, the fiscal rules, which, lots of governments have fiscal rules. Gordon Brown, I think, was the first person who created some. Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules are all about spending down the debt, government covering its day-to-day spending with tax receipts, and, only really taking on debt when it's like part of investment or capital spending. The bit that I think is really problematic, and I've talked about it before on the podcast, is like alongside that, Labour made this manifesto pledge to not raise taxes on working people. And specifically, they said they would not raise employees' national insurance, VAT, and income tax. So Labour, from my perspective, went into the last election with their hands tied behind their back. They massively curtailed the power of government to spend. And they said the three taxes that is the easiest to use to raise money, we're not going to use. I think it was a mistake. It was a political calculation made for two reasons. Like, one, to calm the markets, that Labour wouldn't come in and spend. And, ever since Liz Truss, we're so paranoid about the markets. And two, to make voters less nervous about having a Labour government because, we can be trusted and we're going to be prudent. We're not just going to spend all the money. What have you thought about the things about Chancellor, and what do you think about the fiscal rules and these tax pledges? Like, from my perspective, if Andy Burnham's Chancellor has no flexibility on those, they don't have a lot that they can do.
What do I think about this? I guess the first question is like, will he stick to the fiscal rules? I think there's a question there that you say things when you are running as the MP for Makerfield and becoming the lead. You've got a few hurdles before you become Prime Minister, which is when he said he would stick to them. That doesn't mean when he becomes Prime Minister, he can't change his mind. And I guess the other thing is it's very hard for me to separate this idea around the fiscal rules and what is possible in the Treasury away from who ends up being the Chancellor. Because if the Prime Minister sets the vision and direction of the country, the Treasury holds the purse strings and actually delivers on your vision. And if you have someone who's not creative, who doesn't know how to get things through the Treasury and through the civil servants, and also is not committed to this idea that we need to do things differently, then what you're going to have is a Treasury who basically limits what is possible. And I think this is the most consequential choice. And I think you agree. I don't think you're disagreeing with it being the most...
it's definitely an important appointment. I just don't think we need the number of column inches we have on who and why,
I agree.
What it will mean and what signal, and who said that they didn't like Ed Miliband, and who thinks that he smells. Like, it's too much.
Yeah. I mean, and part of it, again, is it's the way our politics work, right? Those column inches are serving a purpose, which is to influence the thinking of Andy Burnham and set the stakes of, this decision. And given that we don't really know who Andy Burnham listens to, I think it's fair to say those column inches might have some influence. And if he might be scared off appointing Ed Miliband if all column inches are saying the markets will be spooked. if, when it comes to the fiscal rules, and I'm glad you explained it, I'd find it very difficult to explain what the fiscal rules are.
Yeah, we'll get to
But
that.
even within that, there are still things, if we were to keep them in the short term, there are still things a chancellor could do, for example, on taxation, right? Like those are not necessarily linked to the fiscal rules. You could equalize capital gains and generate money there. You could do a series of wealth taxes that send a signal of who this government's for, but also give a bit of fiscal headroom. Even Rachel Reeves weakened a bit of her fiscal rules within that first year and allowed investment.
She slightly redefined them. Didn't she?
Redefined them so that investment was kind of not captured in those fiscal rules. And like a chancellor who comes in could do that and could say, actually, we're not going to use short-term debt metrics as something that is kind of more of a priority than long-term prosperity. So we're going to make sure that investment in infrastructure and in industrial strategy is not something that's capped, and we will borrow to invest. And so there is still room, even within that. But it's like, does Shabana Mahmood have a vested interest or experience to do that? No. Ed Miliband actually has an industrial strategy and plan, is committed to a green economy, which is at least a vision for what an alternative economy could look like.
Also, he's worked in the Treasury. And like, I mean, it's interesting because I was like reading up on all of the gossip on X and in like various media outlets. And one of the things was briefed was that Shabana Mahmood will be picked because Shabana Mahmood doesn't have a vision for the economy. And that means that the economy will run from number 10. And that's part of Andy Burnham's master plan. And like, basically, it's always vested interest. You can make the case for Miliband, right? You could say Ed Miliband has worked in the Treasury. He has run a government department before. He's got a ton of experience working with civil servants in various capacities. And so if you have a radical plan to rewire the state and
absolutely
decentralize power, you want to give it to the person that knows how government machinery works. We had Keir Starmer saying that he felt like he was pulling levers and nothing was happening. And I think it is worth saying at this point that the British civil service has a reputation, rightly so, for being this like force of continuity. And within that, the Treasury is like often loathed within the civil service, within government. There's this notion of Treasury thinking, of like Treasury mindset. And the stereotype about Treasury civil servants is they don't want to spend any money. They don't want to rock the boat. And they stop other people doing things.
They're accountants.
Yeah. But they're accountants with like a super narrow brief who don't want to do anything expansive. Or it's like, they're like accountants and lawyers, very small C conservative people. And like other government departments run afoul of them. And I think it is worth saying, like, there are a couple of examples of how the power of Treasury civil servants can shape things. So like one is going back to the era of George Osborne as Chancellor. I don't know if you remember the Omni Shambles budget, where like people put a tax on pasties, like basically tried to make Greggs really expensive, a ton of really weird measures, all of which came from civil servants. And we had the same thing with Rachel Reeves' first budget, a woman who I'm sure has many talents, but was not an exceptional chancellor and who consistently deferred to civil service thinking about things. And civil servants have no political judgment, which is why a couple of policies were announced, like, whether it was winter fuel allowance. I thought the farmers' inheritance tax was a good idea, but like, you get policies coming out that civil servants say are a good idea, the country doesn't like, or you get a computer says no mentality. And if Andy Burnham really does have a radical plan to shake things up, you're right, the fiscal rules and the tax pledges, they reduce what he can do. He can tax wealth, and he said he wants to. He can raise new taxes that aren't these 3 taxes on working people. And, I think he should. But I guess the thing that I think is missed with the like, oh, you can redefine here and do something else there is, I think Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves made a huge political error of judgment in 2024. Maybe they needed to make these pledges so that the bond markets and the FT and like other newspapers didn't think they were reckless. But I think if you had asked people in the UK what they wanted from an incoming Labour government, they wanted to get rid of the Tories and they wanted someone that would like turn around public services and turn this country around. And this is the problem of like running a reheated new Labour playbook, which is what Keir Starmer did. He like went back to Tony Blair's day and was like, well, what did they do? Let's kind of do that, but more hostile to left-wing people. And it's like, most people in the country think that the country is in a bad place and it needs turning around. And they want a government that will act and will do things. And I don't think they wanted a government that was like, well, we won't raise any taxes. How else are we going to fix the NHS?
And this is the thing, like the only mandate this government walked in with was for change and to make people's lives better. So there's this weird fascination with, well, this was in the manifesto and this is what, I mean, people don't know. People don't care.
Who read the manifesto? I've worked in politics for years. I didn't read the manifesto.
The way they're measuring is through, have you changed my life? Do I believe you can change my life?
Can I get a doctor's appointment? Is it more expensive to do my weekly shop?
My under the radar is very linked to this.
It's just flowing so naturally.
Exactly. And so a lot has been reported around who his cabinet might be, particularly chancellor, something that's getting very little reporting. And so it might even limit what we have to say about it, is who his non-political appointments will be. And so you've talked about the civil service, but also prime ministers and governments have a ton of advisors. And this became clear as we saw the downfall of Keir Starmer and how his advisor, Morgan McSweeney, had kind of run afoul. And Andy Burnham will too, and he's appointed a chief of staff.
James
Purnell, who was an MP who entered Parliament with him back in 2001, was a Blairite and cabinet minister for Blair and Gordon Brown.
Yes, he tried. He had a very unsuccessful coup attempt.
Yes,
which was thwarted by Peter Mandelson. For those of you with that long political memories, yes, so he was a New Labour cabinet minister.
And what he has spent the last little while doing is running a lobbying firm, a global lobbying firm called Flint Global, who advises major tech firms like Apple, Google, Microsoft, as well as mining companies like Glencore. And so fresh off the back of that, he is now going to be Andy Burnham's chief of staff. If ever there was a sign of continuity, it would be James Purnell. The only other advisors that we know that are in the public domain are Jonathan Powell, who's going to stay on as the national security advisor, and Varun Chandra, who is the business advisor. And so there's a debate here. One, which is maybe it's a good thing to have people sticking in government who have experience, particularly in areas that Andy hasn't shown to have experience. So in foreign policy, in business, in running government. But the other side of it is, my experience with politicians actually is they're as good as their staff are. And in many ways, we think we elect people and that what we're getting is a reflection of the people we've elected. But in many ways, it's the people that they staff and that they delegate to get work done and all of the ways in which they maneuver systems to shape priorities. And so to me, it's kind of disconcerting that we're spending so much time thinking about the political appointments, but not all of the people who are getting the top jobs that will actually run government, who will spend the majority of their weeks in number 10.
It's such a good point, and I'm really glad that you brought it up as an under the radar, because you're right. There's the special advisors, and most ministers, junior or senior, will have at least probably 2 special advisors that they get to appoint, political appointments. You can pick who you like, and in number 10 there'll be dozens of special advisors. Then there's this sort of tier of civil service jobs that are technically civil service, but they're kind of political appointments.
Yeah.
So, there'll have been a few Tories in 2024 that had jobs in government departments that kind of quietly cycled out, and then Keir Starmer replaced them. So there's the civil service jobs that are effectively political. There's the special advisors who, you're right, shape so much of how effective a politician is. Morgan McSweeney is obviously the famous special advisor, chief of staff to Keir Starmer. So the advisors have a ton of power. The advisors, as you say, can also we don't know who Andy Burnham will put in every cabinet seat, but we know that they will be sitting Labour MPs or maybe a Labour peer.
There's a public track record who've been elected.
Of the 400, there's 400-ish Labour MPs. There's a few hundred Labour peers. He's got to pick from those. Probably for the senior cabinet post, he's not going to pick someone that got elected 2 years ago and hasn't been involved. So that narrows the field, right? We sort of have a sense, but special advisors could come from anywhere. I'm really glad you brought up James Purnell, because something that I'm really aware of, and partly because it's my own professional background, is increasingly and often special advisors are taken from lobbying firms. James Purnell has had a long career. Flint Global, which is I don't know if they'll consider themselves lobbyists, but the kind of public affairs lobbying firm he's been running, which is huge. And then there will be lots of people who maybe they work for a Labour MP, maybe they were an advisor, maybe they didn't like Keir Starmer, who will now be cycling in from public affairs firms. And to be clear, I don't think there should be a ban on hiring lobbyists, but a lot of these lobbying firms deliberately hire political staffers they're money-making enterprises, right? And, if you work in politics, you love politics, there aren't that many jobs in the UK. You can be a politician, you can work for a politician, or you can work for like a private sector or charity lobbying group. So in effect, you get a lot of people kicking around politics, they don't have a job, they go and work at a lobbying firm. Lobbying firms wouldn't hire political staffers if there wasn't an advantage for them. So even if, James Purnell is squeaky clean, Andy Burnham's right hand, all he wants to do is rewire the state and tax wealth and do all this cool shit. And Flint was just a paycheck. He doesn't care. The thing that we were guaranteeing when you put lobbyists into government is that there are certain people's calls that they will take.
Absolutely.
There are certain people that if your phone rang and you saw who it was, you would answer. And there are certain people...
If my former colleagues ring,
yeah,
I'm
you
likely
pick
to
up the
answer,
phone.
yeah.
If you got a job in government and someone from Green New Deal Rising said, and like some of that's good.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
social beings. We form relationships with people. But like what those lobbying firms are buying is like they're buying an edge, they're buying an advantage. And if a lot of lobbyists go into number 10, go into government, then it probably isn't some sinister phone call or some, hand on the shoulder. It's like the softer stuff.
It is. And I think the reason it's a concern is I'm sure he does have a great relationship with James Purnell. And when you're putting a team together, you want someone you can work with. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you also need someone that you can trust has the same vision that you're sort of leading with. And so when you have someone who's advised these big tech companies, who's advised Thames Water, who you're considering to bring into public ownership, to me, there's a bit of a conflict there, right? Which is, can you trust this person to help shape a government that kind of is bold against industry and corporations? I will say another thing that we should talk about is what is the role of chief of staff? Morgan McSweeney really reshaped that role. Chief of staff should really only be helping you kind of run key personnel, someone who kind of makes sure people who turn up to meetings, that meetings are arranged, that everybody's happy, that teams are working together. Under Keir Starmer, the chief of staff essentially was running a political operation from number 10. And so there's a question there is like, are you bringing in James Purnell to help you just run staff? Or is he going to be the mastermind of your political project? And so it also depends on how that job is defined.
My under the radar for the week, to relate it to Andy Burnham, is big tech companies. So I kind of find it weird. We have the last few weeks, there's been so much speculation. Like anytime Andy Burnham sneezed or like gave an interview or tweeted something, there've been this flurry of articles of like, Andy Burnham will nationalize Thames Water, or like Andy Burnham believes da 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 da. So like anytime he said anything about policy, it's like, oh my God, Andy Burnham's announced this. This is what it'll mean for number 10. Like there was a point where he said that he supports the idea of a land value tax, something he's talked about for many years. And the Telegraph were calculating what the land value tax would be, whether it would replace council tax. And this was like an offhand comment that Andy Burnham had said at an event when he was standing to be the MP for Makerfield in a by-election. So there's all this policy speculation. The thing that I'm fascinated about, I mean, not just with Andy Burnham, but with all Labour politicians, is we do not talk enough about big tech. So there's one exception, which is Keir Starmer's social media ban and the teenage social media curfew that's coming in. So somewhere in the last couple of months, Keir Starmer decided he needed a legacy push play on like trying to copy the Australian ban for under 16s to not be able to use social media. The thing we are not talking about that we absolutely have to talk about, like left-wing politicians around the world have to grapple with this, is we need to do something about big tech. And it's not just restricting people's use. We need to start taxing them.
Absolutely.
And I find it shocking, given how Andy Burnham has positioned himself, that we haven't heard more about this. There've been some rumors of like, maybe he'll kick Palantir out of the NHS. Please do, terrible company. But on a macro level, if we look at our lives and the economy from the last 20 years, we know who all the losers are. Like our high streets are decimated, our wages are stagnating or not growing, everything is getting more expensive, everything is getting harder, our rivers and oceans aren't clean because of the private companies that manage them. And the other thing that's happened is so much of our lives have become shaped and determined by a small number of incredibly large, mostly American technology companies. These companies have so much power of our lives. We're all almost definitely holding a device or have a device in our pocket, or you're listening to this show on a device made by one of these companies, the information that we received is shaped by them. All of these same companies are now in AI, the big technology that's getting so much money and using so much energy. And by and large, these big companies don't treat workers well, and they don't pay their share of tax. And one of the reasons that high street companies are dying is that they cannot compete with these digital entities that are huge, do not pay their staff well, and because they don't have like physical offices, don't pay as much tax. And also, you can look it up, you can Google it. Many of these companies have made a virtue of the fact they don't pay tax. The Google chief executive once said, I don't think we have to pay tax. It's not up to us to pay it. Amazon, I don't think they've run a profit in any of the markets that they're in, even though Jeff Bezos is so rich. So there's this like big, obvious elephant in the room when we talk about how there's no money and too much on welfare and the public sector. It's like there are a set of companies are effectively Smaug the dragon from Lord of the Rings sitting on cash piles. Like, you can Google this stuff. They have huge amounts of money that they don't spend. They're incredibly wealthy. They can like build their own data centers. They don't really pay tax. They don't treat most of their workers well. And we're not trying to tax them.
Yeah.
It's bananas. And like, it's bananas that you'd have a progressive prime minister coming in, someone saying we want to rewire the state, we want to get money in, we want to grow the economy, that wouldn't be trying to tax these people.
Yeah.
And it's not that right. Like, it's not without its problems. I'm not saying it's easy to tax these tech companies, but it's also not without precedent. Tony Blair did a windfall tax on energy companies. He is not known for being a raging socialist. Like, we have to find a way to extract money from those companies, not just because we need the money, but also because they owe it to us. They've ruined our mental health. They've destroyed our high streets. And they've like harnessed all of our attention just to sell us more stuff. So I'm just like, why are we not talking about tech more, Fatima? I want to talk about it.
Amen.
I want to tax them.
It's not just taxing them.
Yes.
We need someone who is like, if we think about the way that we used to think about the economy before is around industries, right? Like the owned things and owned like major means of production. This is a new world in which actually the biggest industries are the ones that are shaping ecosystems, information ecosystems. They are shaping electorate. Like they are, the main ways in which we get information. We know these algorithms are shaped entirely by these social media companies to kind of create these echo chambers. I mean, there's so much research around the world in which how, Facebook and Twitter, known as X now, have sort of fueled a conflict. And so yes, we need to tax them and we need to kind of extract that value, but we also need to think about how to regulate them, how to control them, how to protect people from them. And I read something earlier today where Andy Burnham, apparently in the early 2000s, was really concerned about how we protect people from the World Wide Web when internet access was new. And so I do feel that Andy does have an instinct towards people and how people experience the world and how to protect them. I think there's a massive gap between that and then how you do it in practice. And that's why I think, one is recognizing that there's that gap and then bringing in the right people in. But the lobby around these tech companies is massive. I mean, you mentioned Tony Blair. Tony Blair was said to be writing the government policy. And so it scares me. And it's not just Andy Burnham. I've watched a lot about what's happening in the US and sort of when they bring these tech companies in front of Congress and just like how ill-equipped these politicians are because they're talking about switching Facebook on and off and really like bizarre questions like, do you understand the internet? Do you understand social media?
Someone was asking Mark Zuckerberg what a finster was in a congressional hearing.
Exactly.
I was like, bless you.
And so like I empathize that this is complex, but I do want to put a prime minister who at least sees the problem and says, you know what, these folks are a problem. They are extracting too much value. They're destroying our communities. They're endangering our young people. I genuinely believe that young people are now more in danger from their phones than they are just walking the world. I tell people in my family, like, just let your kids roam London. They're much safer than being in their room with a phone, trust me. But like that's where we're at. And so I haven't seen Andy Burnham or any politician actually in the modern era that is able to take on big tech. And it is scary and it is underreported. And I think that should be the priority, not North Sea oil.
Exactly. And I do think like it's funny. I don't politically agree with Donald Trump very much, but I think he does show like he doesn't always do things that are popular and he doesn't always do things that are easy. Maybe there's a comprehension gap there. Like maybe he thought Iran would be easy, but like a lot of what you end up respecting in people is that they act. And I think a lot of the reason, Keir Starmer is slowly shuffling out of number 10 Downing Street. And when you listen to this, Andy Burnham will have been to the King and will now be living in number 10 Downing Street. And like, I would say one of the big lessons from Keir Starmer's time as Prime Minister was like, no one knew what he stood for and they kind of didn't respect it. It's like, not everyone likes Nigel Farage. I don't like him, but you know what he stands for. And I think you can have respect for someone if you know what they believe in. And so I think Andy Burnham should stand for some stuff. And I think one of the things he should stand for is going after big tech. That is a battle worth fighting. The prize is great because they got loads of money and they've got loads of control. You will have a lot of people behind you. And yeah, I think the media should be talking about it more. Maybe one of the reasons they don't is that they also don't have expertise on the algorithms and the platforms. Or maybe we're just all scared of our content not performing, Like we'll put some clips out about this and like, who knows if we mention Meta, if it'll do well or not.
Subscribe.
Like, comment, subscribe at _pod_. So that's my under the radar, big tech. Do something about it. Andy Burnham, someone. Rein these guys in before we're living in an actual dystopia. That's it from me. Thank you so much, Fatima. Did you enjoy your return performance?
I did. It's so nice to do it in person, actually.
Yeah,
it's so much more chill.
Yeah, we're both sat on sofas rather than like on our screens. So yeah, if you go watch on Patreon or Spotify, you'll get to see our whole faces and bodies rather than like discombobulated little tiles on a screen. Thank you so much for coming. If people want to, I know you're about to have a break, but if people want to stay in touch with you, follow you, see you in your work, where should they go?
Follow us at Green New Deal Rising, and then you can see all the wonderful work that we're up to, especially now that we've got new government coming in.
Opportunities.
We're going to hold them accountable and make sure they deliver for us.
We love to hear it. Great. Thank you so much, Fatima, and thank you for listening.